Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. We are finally live. We are sorry for this small delay. We had some technical issues that you never know that when will happen. So here I have with me Andreas, who is part of the Climate Tracker team. Hi, Andreas.
Hey everyone, good to be with you. Really excited about our webinar and that we finally will discuss what actually Paris means for Marrakech.
Awesome. And I am Anna, as you know, and I'm part of the Climate Tracker team as well. And we are both leading this crazy COP22 campaign that maybe you have joined. But this webinar aims at something much more broader than our campaigns or any work of the Climate Tracker. So this week has been 1 month to COP22, and we are all like really excited to see what may happen in this new stage of the climate negotiations. So we have prepared a presentation for you that I will try to share on screen as well. So you may and may not see us from time to time. So yeah, you now see a presentation. That's awesome. So from Paris to Marrakech is the presentation that we have prepared that aims to give you an overview of what has been the Paris Agreement, what does it say, and also to see and look forward to Marrakech and what may happen in these negotiations. So I will start by giving voice to Andreas on this. So did we save the planet?
Well, yeah, you might remember right after the Paris Agreement, there have been a whole lot of evaluations of what it actually means. It was called the day that humankind will remember as the day when we saved the planet. It was called a death sentence to millions. The Guardian, for example, also wrote that compared to what was political possible, it is a miracle compared to what we needed. It's a catastrophe. So loads of you will actually maybe kind of confused still, like, okay, what does this Paris Agreement actually mean? What are the good parts? What are the bad parts? Who's actually right? Because a lot of smart people said, oh my gosh, it's a catastrophe, it's awful. A lot of very smart people said it's wonderful, it's the best thing we ever had, it saved the planet. And what we're gonna do now is basically with you going through the Paris Agreement, see what is actually in there, evaluate it, and then in the next step, see what that actually means for the COP22 in Marrakech and how that leads to COP22 and also to what this new step that we now have, that the Paris Agreement actually already is into force, means for COP22. But first we go quickly through how we actually got there, because I think it's very important to put the Paris Agreement into context, and I'll just hand over to Anna.
Great, thanks, Andreas. So I think you see me now. So the thing is that you can also send us questions. We've seen that Andreas has different questions about what happened in COP, if it's good or bad, and different people had different ideas. So through this presentation, we will try to enlighten some of these issues, but you can ask some more. So we will be checking Twitter. If you tweet at us, which our Twitter is @climatetracking, or if not, just send a tweet putting #ClimateTracker, and we will try and reply to those questions at the very end. So let me go back to my really nice presentation and tell you about how we got here. So you see a really nice timeline now on the screen, and I'm super proud that this is working fine. So we see that everything, all this history of climate change started in 1992, when they realized that climate change was actually a problem. We knew from like many years already, but okay, 1992 was the start of it. So they saw climate change as a threat and reacted and reached an international convention, which is the UNFCCC, which is maybe your favorite acronym. So it stands for United Nations Framework
Hello, I don't know how it is for you, but I just lost Anna on the way. Um, I'm sure if there is some technical issue, we'll fix it in a minute.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh, thanks, Andreas. Sorry, my internet suddenly disappeared. I hope this was not too much of a problem. Well, it was, I guess.
Should we just start from the very beginning, or?
No. I will just continue with the where I was. Did you continue my timeline?
No, I was not sure if it was my internet. So basically, it just was. I at first thought, like for 1 minute, that I just can't hear you.
Okay, that's fine. Then I will just continue where we are.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, everyone, for that. I don't know what happened with my internet. I hope you are not getting bored. And if you are watching us later, you can always skip this part where me and Andreas just randomly do weird things. So as I was saying, and I will try to put up the presentation again. Then from COP1 that was in Berlin, and the most important one that came after that was for sure COP number 7, which was the one that created the Kyoto Protocol. We all know that was the first agreement that happened that we decided to reduce greenhouse gases, and that was mainly for the parties that were under what is called Annex 2, that was the parties that are developed countries. Sorry. So it took quite a while for the Kyoto Protocol to enter into force. As you can see, until 2005, there was not enough signatures to do that. And from 2008 and 2012, it was the first period when the reductions actually started. So that means that from 1997 to 2008, it's like 11 years that no real action was seen on these issues, because it took quite a while to become into force. But then, not being so boring on this timeline, we moved to what was known as one of the most important failures of the climate change history, which is Copenhagen. They agreed that in Copenhagen, we should reach a global agreement, and it should be the moment of starting to reduce really emissions worldwide and taking this seriously. And for a number of reasons that I want to explain today, it was a very huge disaster for the climate history, maybe, and no agreement was reached. And what they did was to go to Durban, which is the next super important COP, and agree on a pathway that would lead them to an agreement. So this pathway actually works. This what's called the ADP, the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, and that's what led to COP21 in Paris. Paris was the last step of this process, and that's where they agreed this famous Paris Agreement that everybody hears about, but maybe you don't remember what it is anymore. And here we are to COP22 in 2016, going to Marrakech. So I will just leave now to Andreas, because he may have some ideas to give you on the legal form of this agreement.
So the legal form of the Paris Agreement, I think like the one big thing that we actually got there was a international climate deal that does not only affect or mainly affect Annex 1, so developed countries, industrial countries, but the whole world, and is legally binding. However, if you go through the Paris Agreement, if you haven't done yet, just take 1 or 2 hours before you go to COP22 in Marrakech and go through the whole document, and you will see two main parts. The first part is COP decisions. These are not binding decisions, and they basically can be overruled by any other COP with another COP decision. And you have a core agreement that is, well, legally binding actually, but what you have written in there, so the sentences, they are not written in a legally binding way. So the strongest formulation you will ever have or see in there is countries shall do, or you have sentences like parties, not countries, but parties or countries are invited to do, are encouraged to do. And if I just think about, well, if my parents would have said to me like, son, you're invited to do this or that, you're encouraged not to do this or that, have done anything of that, well, I may have like good doubts in that. But on the other hand, and there has been a lot of criticism that the Paris Agreement actually has no legally binding wording in it, while it has a legally binding status. And that is confusing, first of all, because why then does the legal form actually matter? And is it actually a problem? And there's some good reason why it actually isn't that much of a big problem. I think because if we understand this international process in a more depth way than just that the deal has to be legally binding, it is basically setting up a framework, a global framework that country can link in to commonly tackle climate change. And if you look at other legally binding agreements on the international agenda, we don't have, like in a state, this central force that can enforce and that can guarantee that agreement is reached. It's more of a process that is organized, that countries can link in to tackle climate change together. And the legally binding agreement basically shows the level of commitment that is there. It shows a higher level of commitment than just having any kind of agreement if it's in a way, if it's formally legally binding, even if the wording in it is not. That is a bit confusing, but I think it's important to understand that. And it is important to see that even while other agreements might be legally binding, they still might not lead to any well, sanctions or stuff like that. So the not legally binding wording in the Paris Agreement might nonetheless lead to quite a bit of climate action, and it might basically just organize a process in which countries reduce it. And the fact that it had a status of a legally binding agreement then just shows a very high commitment and a very high status of this whole thing, of this whole Paris Agreement, that might lead to much more action than if you would have just another paper full of COP decisions that have not legally binding status. And I think if we move forward from that, we can kind of look into what actually led to this legally binding agreement. And one of the most important thing, if we speak about like the political dynamic behind it, and often the political dynamic behind these wordings are maybe at least as important as the wording in the agreement itself, and we come to the so-called ambition coalition. Anna, if you could just kind of move to our next wonderful slides. Thank you. So for a long time is also what we have in these negotiations anyways, that we have negotiation blocks. You have the developing countries and the developed countries, mainly you have the Russia, Japan, and so on. You have the EU, and you have strong developing country blocks, such as the G77 plus China, such as the LMDC, such as BASIC, and very often you had a lot of finger pointing in between these groups. Or you had in Durban, the US and China, and on the one hand, and the EU and the OCIS and some other developing countries on the other hand, but you never had such a big coalition, such as the Ambition Coalition, which included 79 countries from Africa and small island states, the EU plus the US. And this was a major coalition that really kind of was such a big driver at some point when it came out in the second week of negotiations that basically no other country could get around this block. And they had 4 key demands. First, a legally binding agreement. This was very important. I think we might have gotten it also without this coalition, but they had some other points. A strong long-term goal on global warming in line with scientific evidence, and a mechanism to review emissions and commitments every 5 years. And this is something that will be very important because, as you will see, the pledges of countries might not have been enough that are put forward in Paris, and to then make them better over time and to have a mechanism in there, we will go into how it actually looks, was really important to make this Paris Agreement not an agreement that locks us into a 4-degree world or something. And a unified tracking system for countries' progress on meeting their carbon goals, also very important. And this was not one of the official goals there, but that's why we wrote it in brackets. But the fact that this coalition was mainly organized, so he was kind of the spin doctor behind it. Tony de Bruym, you see him on the bottom of this slide in the middle, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, created a dynamic of around this 1.5-degree goal. And this was something that is, I think, really revolutionary. I think no one 3 or 4 years ago would have found it realistic that we get 1.5 as a target, as a temperature target in this agreement, or very few people only thought it. And the strong ambition coalition that had very strong diplomatic force at some point in the negotiations, I think was also a big driver that we got this 1.5 degrees in the agreement. So having said that there was a big coalition between developing and developed countries for the first time, let's move on to the actual agreement and how that looks, how actually the share between the rich and the developing nations. And we have this wonderful acronym CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility. And we also have in brackets these RC, respective capabilities. You might remember that since the COP in Lima, we have this wording of countries in a position to do so. So not only the countries with the historic emissions, such as my country, Germany, to Japan and so on, but also countries in a position to do so, rich emerging economies, going from Qatar to China, whatever, you know, that more nations actually are now in a position to do so and in a position to reduce greenhouse gases and take more responsibility. But you might also know that this created a lot of tension, and still there's a lot of potential around this topic. So what actually does the Paris Agreement say for it? It says very clearly that developed countries have to take the lead in mitigation and adaptation and transparency, that all parties have to ratchet up the NDC, so all parties have to make stronger climate reduction targets and policies over time in the light of their historical responsibility. So also there, the rich nations, the developed countries have to take the lead, and developed countries have to report finance every 2 years, and there's a bit more flexibility for developing countries in there. One interesting thing I think also there is that it's not written anymore Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries in the agreement, which it clearly refers to, but it's written developing and developed countries, which some people consider as opening the door that some countries such as Qatar are now really or could at some point could at some point be in the position to be considered a developed nation under this agreement. This is more of a cross-cutting issue, but there have been a lot of topics that are much more concrete and are much more the single pillars of this agreement. And Anna will now just go into them.
Yeah, so let's jump now to the Paris Agreement itself. So I hope you have your text ready, because that's getting really geeky. So I was checking the Paris Agreement and I wrote down some of the things. We are starting from the objective, which is the first article of the Paris Agreement. Not, well, it starts from the second, but the objective is one of the most important ones. And it states that the objectives of the Paris Agreement are 3. In general, what the Paris Agreement aims to do, and that's not written anywhere very specifically, but it's to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from 2020, because once the Paris Agreement is signed and everybody starts implementing it, it will start having action in 2020. So people will have to start reducing emissions and reporting these targets and all this. But now let's get into the objective that's written. So we see there's these 3 goals. The first one is to limit the global increase of temperature below 2 degrees, above pre-industrial levels. That means not last centigrade, the previous one, more or less. And pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5. As Andreas was saying, this was super important for the developing countries that wanted to see 1.5 there, because for them and for many countries, 1.5 is very important as a survival issue. The temperature increase to 2 degrees is already too much for them, for sea level rise issues or for crop failure, these kind of things. So it's really a win or a partial win that it says to pursue efforts to limit this temperature increase. Then it states that we need ability to adapt to these adverse impacts of climate change, therefore putting adaptation as one of the core things of the Paris Agreement. That's great, because there has always been the debate if an agreement as such should be only focusing on mitigation and then only talking about reducing emissions, like the more hardcore reducing stuff, and not touching the adaptation issues, which are more sometimes linked to the developing countries. So that's another win or another concession to the developing countries. I remember in COP20 in Lima that even Europe was saying that there was no way that adaptation was going to be there. And you see, now adaptation is here. And finally, they talk about making finance flow consistent. So, of course, of course, the developing countries have this also as a very important thing, because they claim, and with a very right claim, that finance is very important to implement their, for example, reduction targets. So how do we want a very poor country or a developing country to implement some of the targets without help? So that's one of the other points that the objective states, and one of the wins that the finance is included as something important for this agreement. Then I would move to the first pillar of the Paris Agreement, which is mitigation. For those who are not super climate geeks, mitigation means to reduce greenhouse gases. And what the agreement says is that we need to peak globally the emissions as soon as possible. ASAP is as soon as possible. So global peaking means just start going down, but this as soon as possible, it's not really precise. It doesn't mean anything. If you say as soon as possible, it's as soon as I think it's possible. I may think it's possible now, but also I can think that it's also possible, I don't know, in 50 years. So that's a bit vague for the mitigation target. Then it says that we should achieve emissions neutrality in the second half of the century. Emissions neutrality means that everything that you release into the atmosphere, you must also take it back. That means taking it back by planting trees, maybe with other ocean mechanisms, but it may also be using new technologies that we don't really know how they work, that they are just being tested, or they may have really bad consequences for different people or different countries. So it opens the door to use of technology that may be a bit controversial. Then developed countries will have to take the lead and will have to use economy-wide emission. That means including all possible kinds of emission reductions on all different aspects of their economy. So anything you can think of your economy, that if you are in a developed country, that should be affected by the Paris Agreement. That means transport, that means energy, that means maybe even your food systems, I'm not sure. So then it works differently for developing countries. They will have to enhance their mitigation efforts over time, meaning that they have to start slowly, first trying. It has to go according to their national circumstances. So as Andreas was saying, developing country, it's a confusing word because there's developing countries that have a lot of money, like Qatar, and there's developing countries that have not a lot of money, maybe like the Philippines. So depending on those circumstances, they will have to do their mitigation targets and increase them over time. The Paris Agreement also opens the door to markets in a very vague way, and that's something that may be discussed in the following COPs, maybe Marrakech, maybe the next one, but it's not yet defined. And then there's an emphasis, there's a whole chapter on carbon sinks, which take a lot of importance. Why? Because we mentioned before the importance of emissions neutrality, right? So because emissions have to be neutral, we have to take out carbon of the atmosphere, and that's why we emphasize carbon sinks being trees, being oceans, being whatever. Yeah, and that's it for mitigation. And I would go to human rights. So human rights was one of the main demands of the developing countries. You have to think, and if we understand the history properly, human rights is, let's say that climate change is a human rights issue for many of the countries. Because of climate change, people died due to typhoons, people lost their houses, so they had to, I don't know, they ran into poverty, or there was diseases because of that, because of the bad health conditions in after a storm. You can imagine different landscapes or different situations where the impacts of climate change may constitute a human rights violation on your food, on your shelter, or in any of the basic human rights that we all have. And that's why many of the developing countries wanted to have human rights in the agreement. The thing is that human rights ended up only being in the preamble. The preamble, it's the thing that goes just before the objective, and it has no legal force. So it's just a statement just to say nice words before you start the text. It's like a nice introduction, but it doesn't mean that you have to include this or like take it very much into account. So then the core agreement talks a bit about the necessity of gender-sensitive adaptation, capacity building, some issues that are related to the fact that we have to protect the lives of people, but it's not the human rights itself. So that was one of the main, let's say, bad moments of the Paris Agreement, or bad situations when we lost, not totally, but a bit the human rights fight, let's say. I hope you are not getting too bored of it. I'm jumping now to loss and damage and adaptation. If you are super bored, you can tweet at me questions and I will reply to them later. But I want you to keep just for a bit more. This is a nice section now. Adaptation is one of the issues I was telling you that was important to keep a balance between mitigation, and it includes different levels of governance into its definition. That means that adaptation cannot only be done at a national level, because sometimes it's very specific, but it also has to be at the regional or local, etc. And that makes sense. You have to think that if you have a huge country, it may have different realities. Like in the coastline, they will have to adapt to the sea level rise, but maybe in the mountains, they will have to adapt to the lack of snow or the changing of biodiversity, this kind of thing. So that's why having include the different levels of governance, it's important for adaptation. And then we have also loss and damage. I don't know if you're aware of what loss and damage is, but that was one of the main things for the Philippines and for many of the countries that suffer very explicitly from the impacts of climate change. So having paid for loss and damage means, so imagine, you can mitigate the impacts of climate change, right? You can adapt to it a bit, so you can try to move within the temperature change or adapt your crops a bit or put more water into your crops to balance their lack of rain, something like this. But there's a point where you cannot adapt more because you cannot adapt to a typhoon destroying your house or to a super huge, I don't know, change of temperature that makes the old population in danger or things like this. So for these very extreme moments when you cannot adapt anymore to the changes of climate, that's called loss and damage. So loss and damage was included in the Paris Agreement as a standalone element, and that was a huge win because everybody wanted to include it in adaptation, and of course developing countries wanted it as its own point in the Paris Agreement, and that's what they get. The problem is that, and that's what I say in my second point here, it doesn't include any liability or compensation. That means that if you are the US and you have been polluting for so many years, or Europe, or one of these huge emitters that we have emitted the majority of the greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere, we are responsible for some kind of the increase of these greenhouse gases, and therefore for this typhoon growing bigger and stronger, right? So the developing countries cannot ask liability to the developed countries or compensation for the damage that they have suffered. Instead of that, they are agreed on cooperation and giving support. So for example, early warning systems for disasters, some insurances, and the loss and damage chapter was a bit watered down, but still was included, and that was really important. And I will move now to finance, which is maybe one of the most difficult parts of the Paris Agreement, because everybody wants to have money, but no one knows where it will come from. So developed countries have to provide financial resources to assist the developing countries. They have to basically give money to the developing countries, but it's not sure yet, or it's not included in the Paris Agreement, which type of finance it is. So it may be a loan, and that would create more debt, or it doesn't say it has to be additional, so it may come from development aid anyway. So it's a bit controversial. What's good is that the balance between mitigation and adaptation has to be found in finance. Therefore, they will be funding both the mitigation needs and the adaptation needs. And they decided on a floor of $100 billion in 2020, and that can come from public and private sources. This figure appeared some years ago. In 2011, we were already talking on this $100 billion. And the idea is that it will be achieved in 2020, and before 2015, there will be a new and more ambitious one. So before 2025, we hope to find a new financial target that makes also developing countries happy. And finally, developed countries will have to communicate their financial support every 2 years, meaning that they will have to say how much finance they are planning to give to the developing countries, so they can plan and see how many mitigation adaptation actions they want to do. My next step is NDCs, and by now you are super bored, and with another acronym, I think I'm killing you. So the most experts you may know that NDCs are national determined contributions. That comes from the before INDC, which were the intended national determined contributions. So this is something really easy. Every 5 years, a country has to say how much they are willing to do. So I am going to reduce emissions by that much, and I am going to do this adaptation plan, and I am going to give finance for this, this, and that. This paper, this summary of everything you want to do, it's presented to the United Nations, and they will review it, kind of. But we will get there. So the first INDCs that now are NDCs, so just forget about the acronyms. The first things, this thing that we are talking about, were presented in Paris and will last for the next 5 years. So in 2020, we will have a new ones. And now this current ones, the ones that we have, are up to 55 gigatons of emissions in 2030, which is much more emissions than what we are required to stay below 2 degrees. And that was one of the main criticisms. So the whole action that the world agreed to do already is not enough to maintain the temperature below 2 degrees. So imagine 1.5, right? We are a bit late for the 1.5 degree if we continue with this pathway of emissions. As I was saying, these 5-year cycles of these contributions will be informed by a global stocktake, and Andreas will tell us more about that later. That means that they will be reviewed by the parties, and they include a number of things like emission reduction targets, adaptation, finance. There's a part on transparency, on technology transfers, so they will have to report on a number of issues to see how we are advancing to implement the Paris Agreement. And I don't know if Andreas is ready, because I see he's walking, but now we have a very nice slide on the racket-up mechanism and the facilitative dialogue that may help you understand this process of reviewing and not reviewing and implementing new 5-year things and all this. Andreas, are you ready?
Had to move because I'm staying at a hotel. I can't believe I have internet in my room, so I have to stay at a lobby where they now to clean it. So it's a bit like, yeah, some flexibility for my position here. Anyway, I would love to have made this graphic, but unfortunately it was cut. Is an overview of how INDCs might be wedged up, and we see we're now we have a first facilitative dialogue in this year, and a second one in 2018. And what will be done in these facilitative dialogues is not so much that you already have a global stocktake, but that you basically global stocktake, and that you set the ground for actually retching up INDCs and all these things. So I think what we can't expect this year is like really big decisions on adaptation, on like how well INDCs will be wedged up, but we will see how the ground is set and how the tone of future negotiations is set, and this will be very interesting. And especially in 2018, we will also have a special report from a substance from the IPCC on how 1.5 degrees will affect the world and what will have to happen to the INDCs to reach this 1.5 degrees. So you have basically a very 2018 stocktake that will then lead to the first global stocktake and to retch up INDCs in 2023. So what can be created by this facilitative dialogue is setting a ground for actually retching up and making INDCs much more ambitious and prepare this whole process. And secondly, I think this is also very interesting. It is not actually, I mean, like it is on a completely voluntary basis, but it can create some dynamics. So you also have two high-level champions in like so-called two high-level champions in this whole process. These are basically two countries that are willing to do more ambitious pledges, and also hope to like also encourage other countries to do more ambitious pledges. And I think what we have process leading to Paris, that loads of dynamic and ambition was not created within the UNFCCC itself, but outside the UNFCCC. So you had, for example, this meeting between China and the US that about 2 years before COP actually made a lot of people hope for the first time that we really would get a legally binding treaty. Then you had the G7 summit in 2015 that basically supported a very ambitious long-term goal. We had a bilateral announcement between Germany and Brazil and all these things. So you saw that a lot of dynamic was created outside the UNFCCC between heads of states, and also these decisions on how much the NDCs will be ratcheted up are pretty much decisions that are probably made in capital, so by heads of states or governments, not necessarily within the UNFCCC. So I think having this facilitative dialogue is a pretty good idea to keep a dynamic and to ensure that before countries actually have to make more ambitious pledges to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, to and so on, all these kind of things that are related to climate policy, and you have a process that creates a dynamic to actually prepare that, and that we are not ending up in 2023 with kind of like, oh, now we have to do this, but actually, well, how do we do it? And okay, we're kind of surprised. So I think having this process before is a pretty promising thing, but we'll see what we get out of it. And then, like, after 23, we have 2020, and even every 5 years after, we have this review process where countries have to make more ambitious pledges. So that's about the ratchet up and facilitative dialogue mechanism. And we can go on to the next slide, I guess. Because one thing that a lot of people surprised is that we actually just have enough countries and which also emit enough emissions to reach the 2 thresholds to make to ensure that the Paris Agreement enters force. So with the EU as the last one, we saw that there was a very interesting dynamic again when China and the US started, or even the smaller states were much faster, of course. And what you see on this map is the purple kind of countries are the ones that signed the Paris Agreement, but the whatever color in between blue and green this is, these countries ratified the Paris Agreement. And now you have more than 55 countries having ratified agreements representing more than 55% of global emissions. And that means that the Paris Agreement enters force before Marrakech. And that means a whole lot of things for the COP22, and it is not completely clear what it actually means, but it means that the Paris Agreement is actually into force at that time, and that might have a lot of implications for the negotiations. So let's do a quick recap what in general is at stake in Marrakech. So first thing is keep the Paris spirit. By that, we refer to not necessarily that you know, like not these bad things in Paris, that we did not have enough greenhouse gas emission reduction pledges, but at some point in the second week, you recognize that countries stopped finger pointing, that there was a very constructive process in them in some way, that the process was no longer slowed down by differences, or hardly slowed down by differences in between countries, and that the dialogue got much more constructive than in previous years. And keeping that spirit, that the process is not too much slowed down, that there are not too many finger pointing exercises in between countries, might be a very critical point to keep the dynamic that is necessary to actually ratchet up and make pledges more ambitious over time. Secondly, well, set the ground for ratcheting up NDCs. This year is probably not the year where we will see a lot of promises for more ambitious climate reduction pledges. We would like to see it, but it is probably not the year where we get. But, and this is, I think, the critical point here, is we can at least set a ground and set a tone for this discussion, in which hopefully then we will actually get there. Third, climate finance. Climate finance will be a huge thing, or might be a huge thing at this COP, or at least in the upcoming ones. And there's a whole lot of things to that. So first of all, how do we actually reach this promised 100 billion? The Paris Agreement in general is a bit vague about that. And also about these 100 billion, pardon. We might look into what actually is in this 100 billion promises, because right now, for example, also commercial export credits are counted among these promises. and to kind of pressure countries that these 100 billion are actually additional financial aid and not just commercial anyway would have been put out there, is critical, I think. Also to have an accounting system and maybe something such as a fund, because we see that countries kind of promised in a vague way that they have to ratchet up their financial commitments, but what it actually means is not clear. And to have a report, for example, such as the 2018 report on 1.5, that clearly points out guidelines, how much money we need for adaptation, for loss and damage, and for mitigation. That would be something that really might create a good dynamic to ratchet up financial commitments there. Also, a clear financial challenge will be to put more money into adaptation, because while the Paris Agreement states that there has to be found a balance, the balance so far is clearly not there. So the vast majority of climate finance goes into mitigation, so at least in these kind of funds where aid is provided, and not into adaptation measures. Yeah, and then set the ground for adaptation, loss and damage implementation. This also links into discussion that we need obviously more money for that, because the money so far there is just not enough, and to create a dialogue around that. So COP22 is the first meeting where we will have not only the COP22 but the CMA1. CMA1, you might remember CMP, but CMA1 is the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, the first meeting of these parties. I have literally no idea how they got from this to the acronym CMA, but however it's called that way. And so we have two main meetings. So you might remember that you have normally the COP and you have these two side bodies, and now you also have the COP, the Conference of the Parties, and the CMA1, the meetings of the parties under the Paris Agreement. And the CMA1 actually decides about the Paris Agreement implementation, the procedure and transparency, the NDC communication, the global stocktake, and the ambition nationalism. So a whole lot of shit. So it is quite an important meeting, but at the same time, only countries who have already ratified the Paris Agreement, countries or count as parties, which are with the right to vote and all this stuff. Countries that have not formally ratified it are considered observers. So basically, what you, if you work in an NGO or kind of stuff, are at the moment in the COP. That leaves us with the challenge of an inclusive process, you know, but because I think that the main challenge there is that we might want to move forward with deciding about procedures, transparency mechanisms, certainly with global stocktake and all these kind of things, how all this works out, but it might not make sense to do this, leaving out how do we actually, or how will countries be able to make this process inclusive? Because on the other hand, you might also be able to imagine that this leaves the door open for countries to use this unclarity about the process, to slow down the process and to not get anywhere, or to just frustrate a lot of countries if it's not done in an inclusive manner. So there's a whole bunch of options I'm just going to briefly tell you about. So the first option that is on the table is just to start CMA1 during COP and immediately closes and not decide about anything. Hopefully that will not, is to make just a decision that under the CM1 also countries that have not the Paris Agreement yet but have signed it are able to vote in a process, vote on procedural transparency and all these matters under the CMA1. Another opportunity is that they basically just start discussing it but not make any major decisions and wait for countries to do so. And a last opportunity, let me get to that back a bit, because there are two options for what I just explained, which are also like weirdly complicated UN geeky shit. But a last opportunity in general also would be that the CMA1 decides that the COP actually is the meeting which has then the mandate. So it basically gives back the mandate to the COP to discuss all these things like procedural transparency measures, global stocktake, and all these things under the Paris Agreement. And then in general, the meeting of the CMA1, the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, could be suspended, so end during or before or at the end of COP22. It could also, this term means suspensions, just be extended. So they just kind of make a break in between the COP22 and the COP23, and they don't end this first CMA1 meeting also include more parties. So I think it is very, very hard to say what of these options will actually be happening at COP22. Maybe there are even other options that will happen. But I think regarding CMA1, it is really critical to look at the process at the moment and to make it transparent and inclusive in a way that does not piss off too many countries. So we kind of still keep a constructive dialogue that enables the international community to actually ratchet up their INDCs and ratchet up ambition in the next years, because this will be very, very critical to be able to meet a 2 degrees or hopefully a 1.5 temperature goal. I hope this did not confuse you too much. It's a bit complicated and a bit, well, weird UN diplomatic shit, but I think it's very, very important to keep these options in mind, to understand what will happen during these 2 weeks in Marrakech. So that leaves us at the end then thinking about what did we actually get by the Paris Agreement, and I guess Anna will join me for that again. So do we have a solid structure to fight climate change? Yes, I would say we have this climate agreement, and at least provides us with a structure to and a global framework to really get into the climate fight on a global level.
Yeah, the problem is that the structure right now, it's leading to more than 2 degrees warming world. So that it's like a bad point of not the Paris Agreement itself, but the ambition of the country so far. So that would be a bad side of the Paris Agreement.
But on the other hand, we do have a mechanism to raise ambition over time. And this, I think, is a very good thing. So while we don't have enough pledges made before Paris, in a perfect world we would have, we do have in the Paris Agreement a mechanism to compensate for that.
Yeah, of course. But the problem is, and as always happened in this process that has been a lot bottom up, it's that it leaves emission reduction to countries' willingness. So if the countries are willing to reduce emissions, they can do so. But if not, they can just present really non-ambitious targets or invent other emission neutrality issues, whatever, to avoid reducing emissions, which is the important thing here. So you see, we have mixed feelings, and we cannot say right now if the Paris Agreement it's good or not, or if it saved the world or not, which was our main question.
But I guess to kind of like to summarize them what it means for Marrakech and for the upcoming years, I would like to use another quote I kind of heard evaluating the Paris Agreement. It probably is my favorite one to summarize it. Bill McKibben said the Paris Agreement did not save the world, but or did not save the climate, but it provided us with the chance to do so. So I think what we have there is this framework and this chance to kind of ratchet up ambition over time. But this is the kind of process we're now getting into Marrakech, and that we're now really starting. And only if we manage to pressure governments hard enough to actually ratchet up their ambition over the coming years, and very, very soon, we will be able to reach these 1.5 or 2 degrees in the Paris Agreement, and only then can actually say that the Paris Agreement was a success. If we don't manage this, then, well, it might be the failure it was. To my opinion, this is how we can look in that situation, and that's actually why we really should be looking forward to coming to Marrakech to ratchet up, to really fight to ratcheting up ambitions, and also to pressure local or like domestic governments, because I think they will have to make a lot of ambitious decisions in the next years to make the Paris Agreement the success we want it to be.
Awesome. Thanks, Andreas. And as you see, to our initial questions, so did we save the planet? We don't have a very clear question now, but we provide you with a lot of tools and ideas on how you can evaluate it yourself. You can make your own mind. You can read a lot of information that's on the internet and a lot of articles that Climate Tracker has been publishing. And you can make your own idea of how good or not is the Paris Agreement, and if we are really saving the world now, in the future, or in Marrakech. So let me just go back to see if you can see me. Yes, Howie. So thanks for following this conversation for such a long time. I hope you are not too bored. We tried to make it fun. And I'm now checking Twitter and seeing if you have any questions for me. And yeah, we have people saying that it was nice and they learned. That's great, but that's not a question. Yeah, I have one question from Stanley from China. And he asked about consistent climate finance. Yeah, he says that it's very difficult to reach 100 billion per year by 2020. That's really challenging. That's what we think about it. Andreas, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so in my point of view, the challenge is not so much that these 100 billion at some way will be reached. So you had this OECD report coming before Paris that said that in 2014 already 61 billion were reached, and countries made additional pledges before Paris that so what they would do before 2020 that in total summed up to about, I think, 82 million. Like don't kind of make like it might be 81, 82 or 80, but it was around 80 million. So countries were in the position to say, well, we're kind of good with that. But I think the more critical question is what is actually in this 100 billion. So I talked about early on that also commercial export credits were counted as financial as climate finance aid, or for example you had some general aid projects, and about 10% of the money were used for climate stuff, like putting solar panels somewhere or stuff. But the whole project budget was counted as climate finance. So I think the main challenges there are not so much reaching this 100 billion, but to make sure that this 100 billion and what is added on top of that actually are additional financial aid, and to maybe have a common definition of what is counted as additional financial climate finance, and to have a accounting system in place that makes it possible to make pledges comparable. Because what you have, and I won't go too deep into that, it's really nerdy stuff, but what you have right now is that lots of countries make a lot of tricks in their pledges. So for example, when two countries say they provide 2 billion of climate finance, the one 2 billion might be actual 2 billion, but the other ones kind of count in some extra taxes or interest rate stuff, and it's actually just a third of that sum. So I think having a clear accounting system there, having a clear system in place that actually ensures that this aid is additional and also real climate finance and not commercial. I think these are the main challenges, and then also to kind of have a process of ratcheting this 100 billion up, because it's certainly not enough. And also, last point really, to kind of make sure that there is enough finance for climate adaptation, because the majority right now goes into mitigation, the vast majority.
Awesome, Andreas. It looks like you became a climate finance expert recently. So thanks for that. I have one more question so far from Tosca from Italy. And she says, what can we do as civil society to push states to make more stringent pledges soon enough to escape reaching the 2 degrees warming? So, wow, civil society mobilization. I think I want to answer a bit of that, but maybe Andreas wants to jump later. So, yeah, you can do many things. The work that we do as Climate Tracker is putting it in the media. There's many media in different countries who are not reporting about climate change, or who are reporting it partially. For example, in my country, in Spain, we only report about the consequences, but we don't know how it was created. So how do you want to stop something that you don't know how it was created? So we try to put media, to put climate change on the spotlight of media, and that works for raising awareness of society, but also reaching governments that read those newspapers, right? But aside from that, you can do many things. Of course, I'm sure you're part of organizations that fight every day by not only raising awareness of people, but also demonstrating. I think this kind of political involvement is very important to demonstrate that people are caring about those issues. If not, if we don't mobilize these governments to whatever they want, and that has proven in many places. And I'm sure Germany, as Andreas comes from, has a lot of examples of people fighting for more renewable energy and getting it because they are leading on that. So I know it's a very broad answer, but it's my way of getting climate change over there. And I always speak about it. You can do the same. I just include climate change in every conversation, every just stupid mention about the weather. I'm like, climate change. But Andreas, do you have to add something to that?
Yeah, like I'm pretty sure you're the most amazing person to speak at a party to if you then start with, oh yeah, and I just want to briefly mention CBDR. No, I think like that basically just summed it up, and I just think the one thing we can definitely say about the Paris Agreement, while we can't say was it a real success or not, is that we now definitely have to pressure governments, and if you do it by writing articles, by go out and demonstrate, by lobbying, however, it is very important that we keep up the pressure in these next 5 years, because they are really key to keep global warming below 2 degrees or hopefully 5 degrees. And I think, yeah, just great question, because that actually I think like is what we could end this webinar with, that we kind of just have to underline once again that now's the time that we have to make sure that the goal of the Paris Agreement is actually reached.
Yeah, so let's start doing this. Let's start implementing the Paris Agreement by fighting for it, let's say. And first was getting the knowledge. You got it here, now you can go and change the world. Thanks, Andreas. I think we have no more questions so far. I just checked all social media and I think that's fine. So thanks everyone who sent some. Thanks for watching us. And we will be doing more webinars, we always do. And of course, we will do from Marrakech. So if you cannot come to Marrakech, but you would love to know what's going on, see what's being discussed, we'll be live reporting, we will be doing articles. And you can always send questions. We are really happy to help. Andreas, do you want to say goodbye as well?
Yeah, thanks all for watching and have a lovely day. Goodbye. Hopefully see you in Marrakech. Let's do this.
Thanks, everyone.